I was very disappointed in Resident Evil Requiem. So I decided to go back and play through the original Resident Evil. It was high time that I do it. It was high time that I finish this game. This is something that I've been putting off for years. It's something I'd never done before. I have tried to play through this game several times and I just never could manage it. It was just a little bit too much. But I have beaten it now, and not only is this way better than Requiem, not only is it good throughout the entire experience, not only does it have great voice acting, great cinematics, a huge amount of replay value, it's probably one of the best games on GameCube. And I'm sure this isn't really a controversial take for those of you who have played this game extensively over the years, but for me, going back through it and playing it again, this is kind of a new experience. So kind of getting to the point where I'm learning the game and learning everything about it. This is probably the best Resident Evil I've ever played. Obviously, 4 is very special to me, but that really is kind of a different thing. I really do think we need to distinguish between like action based Resident Evil and actual real survival horror Resident Evil. Resident Evil isn't much of an innovator when it comes to the action game space, but it is absolutely a trendsetter when it comes to traditional survival horror. And it's so interesting going back to the remake of Resident Evil to kind of experience this firsthand because this is the kind of game that you just don't get anymore. A game where you're thrust into these insane situations with very little clues on how to proceed, and you just kind of fumble around until you just kind of figure it out. Like this game is very, very, very counterintuitive in some ways. A lot of things are obtuse, a lot of things aren't very clear. You kind of have to like just kind of mess around with random items until you figure out puzzles in some cases. Like I going through this, there were some things I remembered from my previous playthroughs, but also things that I kind of just had to figure it out intuitively or just kind of like fumble around with for a bit. And it was a very interesting experience because this is absolutely one of those games that were still made in a period where they were allowed to produce games that were tailored for gamers. Okay. There are cutscenes in this, but they are very short, they are to the point, and they don't detract from the overall experience of being stuck in a house with a bunch of zombies. In that sense, it's radically different from something like Requiem, which has all of these like weird detours, these weird cutscenes, these weird cinematic bits that don't really lead anything. It's very interesting playing Remake because what you get is basically all of the good parts of Requiem kind of extended into an entire game. I beat all of Requiem in about 10 hours. Uh, Remake took me longer than that. Remake, a game that came out in 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube, took me longer to get through than Resident Evil Requiem, a game that was like supremely padded with nonsense that did not need to be there, a game that just didn't have anywhere near the thought put into the level design, the artistry, or the story. Requiem just was not as good as this. And it's very interesting to say that. It's very interesting to see just how much better this game is from a design standpoint, whether it's like the general combat, when it comes to the enemy variety, when it comes to like the progression, when it comes to like, finding and using items, when it comes to like, optional side content. Resident Evil Remake pretty much stomps Requiem in every single way, shape, and form. And that is very surprising to me, considering how this is a Nintendo GameCube game from 2002. This was a Nintendo exclusive for years, and it far surpasses the brand new AAA Resident Evil Requiem. It is insane how far ahead of the rest of the industry the GameCube was at the time. When it was getting games like this and Wind Waker, Super Smash Bros. Melee, Metroid Prime, some of the best games that ever been produced in 1 year period. Okay. It was just phenomenal to see how many like all-time classics came out on this thing at the time. And it's no wonder that the GameCube has gone on to be one of the most beloved consoles in history because anybody who had one knew that not only was it far superior to the Xbox or PlayStation 2, that it was far superior to consoles that have come out since. The older I get, the more baffled I am by the narrative that the GameCube was a kiddie console. Because when you look at like the release schedule, when you see games like Wave Race Blue Storm or this or Eternal Darkness or like Metroid Prime, what you get are games that are very clearly not tailored to a younger demographic. If anything, I would argue the GameCube is where like a lot of these games started defining their own wider appeal. This is where they started getting a adult audience. This is where like a lot of people who had grown up playing NES and Super Nintendo were now older and playing like new entries in their beloved franchises and starting to come to terms with the fact that The Legend of Zelda did not have an overarching story. Coming to terms with the fact that games were no longer becoming overly realistic. They were coming to terms with the fact that different franchises were releasing on Nintendo consoles to extreme critical praise and hype. The GameCube era is an interesting time in Nintendo's history because I think it's the last time that we really saw a lot of real high quality third party support from developers. And not just in the sense where we're getting third party releases on the platform. I'm talking like really good, high quality, exclusive titles that are just as good, if not better, than the competition. And that's one of the things that really struck me about Resident Evil Remake is that I went back through and played Luigi's Mansion again around the same time. And I've long heard, a lot of Resident Evil fans say that Resident Evil Remake is better and that Luigi's Mansion was disappointing and that it was too short. And honestly, I do think both of the games kind of excel at different things. Luigi's Mansion has better puzzle solving. It has its own unique vibe. It has its own unique like personality, replay value, tone. Luigi's Mansion is the game I played growing up. And, as an adult, I went back and played Remake. Like, the correct answer is they're both very, very good. And as a result of that, both of these games elevate each other and allow both of them to become classics in their own respects on the same platform. So, in essence, Resident Evil Remake is a demonstration of how third-party games on Nintendo console should work. Is with that third parties come out and produce games that Nintendo themselves are not making. But that isn't what happened. At the time, people had this mentality that Nintendo was for kids and that games like Resident Evil were wasted on Nintendo platforms. The industry looked at this and rejected it. They refused to buy GameCubes for Resident Evil, one of the most popular and critical acclaimed games on the original PlayStation. I noticed recently that this game was one of the best selling titles on PS3. People would rather wait for a PS3 port of this game than buy a Nintendo GameCube for this day one. Back when it was still brand new and mind blowing. Like the mindset people must have been in at that time when it came to the Nintendo hate must have been insane. But there you start seeing the problem. These games come out on Nintendo hardware. They're very popular. They're very critically acclaimed. Everyone loves them. And yet you have a certain demographic of people who refuse to buy or support them purely because of the platform it's on. My opinion upon playing this game for the first time, going through the entire story, going through like, every event, going through like, getting every item, exploring every room, solving every puzzle. Like, this is something that should be considered one of the greatest horror games of all time, but it's not. The only reason this isn't considered the greatest survival horror game ever made when it comes to like, the resource management, when it comes to like the puzzle solving, when it comes to the action, when it comes to the variety, when it comes to like the length of the game. Again, this took me longer to get through than Requiem, a modern game, and it had less padding. The only reason this isn't universally declared to be the greatest of all time is because it launched as a Nintendo exclusive. And we saw the same thing happen with Zero. We saw the same happen with 4 eventually. We saw like, Resident Evil's golden period was this era. We were getting all these exclusive games. We got all the ports of the classics. The GameCube is still the best platform to play Resident Evil, full stop. And yet, for some reason, The entire industry rallied to downplay games like this, to downplay Eternal Darkness, to downplay the Metroid Prime, to downplay like everything Nintendo was doing at the time. And the end result of this is an industry that glazes games like Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and Resident Evil Requiem. Like mediocre games that have tons of problems, that diminish from the originals, that are not as good as the titles on GameCube. And yet, because the audience never played those games, because they don't have the slightest clue about them, because they don't know that Resident Evil was better on Nintendo, we have created a culture of Resident Evil fans that refuse to consume high quality content. They have refused to play the best Resident Evil games out of some blind loyalty to their preferred platforms. They are completely unaware of just how much better Nintendo was than their favorite thing back in 2002. Now, it's important we talk about this because it's very important to preface why Resident Evil Requiem was put on the pedestal that it was, because the fans who played that and did not play Remake have a very warped perspective as to what Resident Evil actually is. To them, Resident Evil was always an action game. It was always like this very casual, fast-paced third-person shooter franchise. So to see it become shift and become more horror focused is something that's mind blowing to them. It's like, oh, I can't believe Resident Evil is a real horror game now. Like completely ignoring the far superior Resident Evil remake, because that's the thing that really gets to you as you play Resident Evil Remake, where you're going through the halls, you're fighting zombies, you're fighting items, and you're just like all the time. You have no idea what you're doing. You have no idea where you're going. You have no idea what you need to do to progress. And you just kind of have to figure it out simply by just walking around, interacting with the environment, solving puzzles, getting items, just figuring out how the game works. And there is a kind of warp logic to it. You can indeed like puzzle your way through this game and get to the end, but you very well may end up like not doing everything in the game. For example, getting the best endings. I struggled figuring out like how to do the to save Chris at the end and go through like the final boss period. And in the end, Barry still died, apparently. You know, I had to like really struggle, going through this final area, trying to figure out what I was doing, trying to like, accomplish things, trying to like, get the best possible ending. And what ended up happening is that like I completely screwed up somehow. And so Barry died and Chris and Jill ride off into the sunset in a helicopter. Uh, and it just kind of dawned on me on just how much of an edge classic Resident Evil actually had. Because you have these named characters that have their own unique designs, personalities, backgrounds, like dying horrible deaths. Okay, you interact with them a little bit. You can do some quests for them. There are some things that happen to them, right? Like it's so interesting to kind of see how this game manages to introduce you to the situation with very little context, very little lore, and like give you a little bit of information to keep you invested and interested, because I think objectively the game isn't very well written. Like people have pointed this out, how like Wesker's motivations make no sense and how like the game just kind of is kind of goofy in some aspects, but you don't necessarily know that on a first playthrough. So like on a first playthrough, you're going into it blind, fumbling around, trying to figure things out, and it's not obvious how dumb it all is. It's very interesting how they do this, because like everything is hidden behind like lore tablets and logs and just like which are way better than today's BioShock like audio logs, by the way. You read these logs, learn about the characters, the backgrounds, and you start piecing things together. But at the same time, you're going to miss things, you're going to overlook things, you're not going to understand certain things. And as a result of that, by the time you do get the whole picture and realize just how dumb the plot actually is, you've put like 20 hours into it and had the time of your life. Okay. Like it's interesting kind of looking at this game's weaknesses, the wonky voice acting, the storytelling, the camera angles, and seeing how the developers were able to work with these limitations to make something that's not only compelling, but the peak of its genre. There were so many times in this where I was like, marveling at like the shit. Why? At the art design, at the creature design, at the camera angles, at like the unique traps. Like a lot of this would not work in a modern setup with the third person behind the camera angle. Like what they were able to do was make something that has its own unique vibe that feels very much like a video game. And this is something that I've been saying a lot in regards to like modern games, how they're like obsessed with realism and having realistic physics and having like you know, things make sense, in the real world. Resident Evil isn't like that. Like Resident Evil is very, very traditionally video gamey in its presentation, where things just kind of happen and you're just kind of expected to accept it. And I think that's what makes this such an interesting title compared to modern entries because of the way it's set up, because of its design, because of what it tries to do, because of its like presentation, what you get is something that feels kind of larger than life and has its own unique personality and vibe. It's not realistic at all, but at the same time, that's what makes it compelling and interesting and makes what people want to like experience it. And this is something that I say a lot about when it comes to fiction. Like striving for realism leads to a diminished experience because you're not really thinking outside the box. You're not delivering on like the fantasy. You're not delivering on like a unique experience that you can't get anywhere else. And that's the thing about Remake is that this is truly a video game that you will not experience anywhere else in any other format, in any other genre, in any other series, really. Like Resident Evil peaked here. This is the premier Resident Evil game to this day because it most closely exemplifies what made the series special to begin with. I know a lot of people who consider this their favorite game of all time or their favorite Resident Evil or their favorite horror game. And it's very easy to see why. But what's equally interesting is just how many people outside of the community refuse to acknowledge its roots, refuse to acknowledge where it came from, the cultural landscape, Nintendo's involvement in the project, the console it launched on, and the simple reality that this is a game that really shouldn't exist because we were told that Nintendo games have no third party games. They don't have mature games for adults. They don't have horror games. And here we have a horror game from the biggest horror franchise on the planet, its premiere entry launching exclusively on Nintendo GameCube in 2002 and becoming one of the best games on the console. Like, it is insane to me that as many people as they did tried to downplay this fact. There was nothing on PS2 as relevant as this. There's nothing today that was as good as this or RE4. Like these games, these series, this franchise, it peaked on the GameCube. And the simple fact of the matter that people can't accept this and instead try to glaze stuff like Resident Evil 5 or 6, 7, 8, Requiem, it really just goes to show you just how out of touch the general Resident Evil community is, how they're unwilling to admit how far they've fallen. And obviously, it may not be as bad as something like Final Fantasy, but Resident Evil was something that established itself on the GameCube. It had a following on the GameCube. It has a lot of Nintendo fans. It's this beloved IP. And yet, because of Capcom's refusal to stick with and continue supporting Nintendo consoles with high quality Resident Evil releases, we are now in this era of stagnation, a period of stagnation that is only just now coming to an end. Resident Evil Requiem, for all of its flaws, did indeed release on Nintendo Switch 2 day and day. It was a reasonably good Resident Evil game. It wasn't on par with this, but it was a step in the right direction. So hopefully in the future, Capcom learns from their mistakes and starts producing newer, higher quality Nintendo exclusive titles in this franchise. However, even if this doesn't happen anytime soon, I believe the overwhelming trend when it comes to these older Resident Evil games, when it comes to the classics, when it comes to like this fixed camera angles, when it comes to these titles, they are going to continue moving huge units on Nintendo consoles. We have seen Requiem 7 and 8 do very well. Remake did very well. All the Resident Evil games that come out on these consoles are doing huge numbers and stay very, very relevant, especially on sale. Uh, so seeing future re-releases of these games on Nintendo consoles is going to lead more Nintendo fans to discovering these games, becoming fans of them, and considering them by proxy Nintendo games. Okay, what we're going to see is like a slow, gradual decline of the PlayStation and PC hold over the franchise. We are going to see less people buy these games on PlayStation and PC in order to play the superior Nintendo versions. Like this is going to become a common thing going forward. It's the Switch 2 version of Requiem already outperformed the Xbox version, and it's only a matter of time until Nintendo dominates the PC and PlayStation versions as well. And until that happens, I will be advocating for the Nintendo version. It was the best version of the game by far. It has the most features, it has the most portability. It is the best. So, with all that being said, this is Harman Smith. Thank you for watching my review of Resident Evil Remake. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.